Hello everyone, and welcome to this video, which is going to be addressing topic 1 in regards to a critical appraisal of professional standards in teaching and the reading from Johnson from 2015, looking at professionalisation in teaching from a critical theory approach. If you have done my previous unit, MTS500, you'll be aware that I do take a critical theory approach to much of the work that I do in education, the research that I conduct, as well as the way in which I conduct a master's unit. So if you're not familiar with such a critical approach, hopefully I'll be able to ease you in a little bit in this particular video and just provide a bit of a context as well. For those of you that have followed me through, you'll have started to get this understanding of looking at things from a more critical perspective, understanding power, discourse, and the way in which education is arranged in particular ways in this country in the present moment, and how we appraise that, how we understand that. And I think Johnson's paper is very good in regards to that and arguing for a critical theory approach, arguing why it matters that certainly as pre-service teachers, you begin a dialogue with understanding what is going on here. In this particular instance, professionalization of teaching, what is going on here? What is the purpose of why we need to professionalize? What are the standards for? What are they doing? And the effects. So I just want to range over the paper and highlight a few key aspects in this particular video. Certainly, if you haven't read Johnson's paper yet from topic 1, you need to read that first before you engage with this video and listen to what I have to say. So taking some of Johnson's points here and just working with them and bringing in a few other, she does a fantastic job of a literature review in a lot of ways and presenting you with a lot of very interesting findings from a range of different papers. And I'm going to bring in some other stuff as well that she doesn't explicitly reference, but a similar set of authors. Johnson, one of her, the first things she does on page 301 is reference Sachs, talking about what does professional identity mean and how is it framed, and this idea of professional identity being a set of attributes that are imposed upon the teaching profession, either by people from outside or by members of the teaching fraternity themselves. And this is important, this notion of what is being imposed upon teachers when we consider what does professional identity mean. And certainly as pre-service teachers, a very clearly defined set of characteristics and attributes are being imposed upon you. And as pre-service teachers, that would sort of seem naturally like, well, I'm learning how to be a teacher. Somebody needs to tell me what to do and what I need to demonstrate. What you quickly realize as you gain more experience is that these attributes and characteristics don't necessarily reflect everything that teachers do day to day, or they become somewhat restrictive. More on that later, but that's something you begin to realize very quickly. I do want to move on to this notion of control, though, because it's very important, and in a way Johnson's keeps talking about this particular aspect of professional development and what it means, particularly as this idea of it's a form of control. So she cites Corican from 1995 as seeing that professional development as a form of control, that teachers' current skills, responsibilities, and practice is some way not acceptable. Because if you're going to reform something, you've got to say, well, there's a problem. You're rendering a problem. So there is a problem with teachers not being professional enough. So we need to reform their practice. We need to ensure that there is a standard set of attributes, characteristics that clearly linked to student learning and outcomes, and certainly that's what the ATSOL standards do, and Johnson talks about that. But there's some sense that there's falling standards, so we need to control the situation from certainly from the government's point of view, from a national point of view, control it and bring all teachers under that control to ensure that they raise their standards and they all meet the required particular development standards. So, pre-service teachers are here, then once you graduate, et cetera, and as you move up. I just want to just talk a little bit about control, what that means, controlling teachers' work. There is some great papers that you can read further if you're interested in this idea of the work of teachers being controlled in particular ways. So there's a paper by Hall, 2004. If you're interested, email me. I can give you the exact reference. And Smythe, SMYTH from 2000, working on this idea of what does control mean? How have forms of control embedded themselves in the teaching profession? And there are a number of ways. There are 6 different arguments in regards to this. I just want to mention those briefly. So the first form of control that has certainly embedded itself in the work for teachers in the teaching profession can be called regulated market control. So this is where the kind of the metaphors of the market, the liberalized or neoliberal market, consumer demand, they become imposed upon schools and the work of teachers. So what success means, schools being able to be profitable, meet consumer demand or client demand, and teachers' work becomes measured against or evaluated in terms of these kinds of outputs. And also this idea of competition is very important. You see that with, say, the My Schools website and the effects on schools that they have to engineer themselves around parent choice. So that's one way that the work of teachers has been controlled in particular ways at the present moment. Another way is technical control. So this is thinking about that, or it's embodied in structures rather than people. So there's this idea of teacher-proof teaching materials and textbooks. So really the idiot's guide to mathematics or science or English, that anybody could come in and deliver a set of materials that's prescribed and created by the so-called experts, that somebody could come in and just wholesale do in the classroom to reach specific outcomes. So that's a form of control as well, that technical control. So you control structures, materials, curriculums. In a way, you can see the Australian curriculum as that, even though it's not explicitly around materials, but a lot of materials have been developed that align perfectly with the Australian curriculum. So you pick up the textbook or pick up a package and you deliver it. The third form of control is called bureaucratic control. So this is where there's a kind of the institutions become structured around hierarchical power, and that things like supervision, evaluation, performance management, where there's career progression in particular ways. You must demonstrate X, Y, and Z before you are able to advance your career. So that bureaucratic control of teachers in their performance, in how they're evaluated, has become sort of ramped up, particularly in the last 20 years. Corporate control. So this is the focus as the institution as an economic rather than a social good. So, where that competition prevails. So rather than learning being part of a social good, which is still there, it's still embedded, but that competition is the end goal here, in schools performing in the best way, getting the most students into university, which you can argue is a social good, but when the competition itself prevails. So you can see this in the formation of league tables. So where schools are ranked, and the highest schools are ranked as number one as achieving because they've got the highest results. So that form of competition and the way in which that affects schools and controls teachers' work, how they teach, then is shaped around that competition. Also when schools become, when your head of department is your line manager and they control your work and ensure that you're adhering to the policies and practices of the school, rather than seeing the school as a group, all the people who work in the school as a group of professional equals, or that you might have a mentoring and mentee relationship that sort of breaks down when it's your boss. That's as well occurred very much so in the last 20 years. So a fifth one, so I've just got two more quickly to overview. Ideological control. So this is when this notion that you have a hegemony of belief. So a good teacher has to attain certain characteristics. So this is what Johnson really focuses on here in terms of professional development. So and it works in with pre-service teaching and training, that there's certain conceptions of what is competent, effective teaching, and hinting over to the next video, this kind of move away from a child-centered discourse of what teachers do, so focus on the child, with more of a market-based discourse. So I'll explore more of that in the next video. But this idea that what has become recently the dominant ideology framing the work of teachers, and you can see there is a dominant ideology around, certainly in professional discourse, of what teachers do, focused on many of the effects, much of what I've just covered in the last few minutes, that these controlling aspects of teachers have now shaped the ways in which we define what who good teachers are and what it is that they do. And it affects the everyday practice of teachers in classrooms. And lastly, but not leastly, and certainly if you're new to some of these concepts around disciplinary power, and the French philosopher Michel Foucault talks about these technologies of power. So things like hierarchical observation, normalizing judgment, examination, how individuals become disciplined in particular ways. So again, if you've never heard of Michel Foucault, again, it's a huge, he's a massive figure in French philosophy, but certainly he's made his way into much of education, and many critical theorists work with Foucault, including myself. It's worth, if you're interested, I can send some accessible readings on Foucault. Don't worry too much about wrapping your head in regards to that, because there's lots of stuff in the Johnson reading and Canella as well around, and they touch on these ideas anyway. So I just want to read another lovely quote from the academic researchers here in Australia, Burke, Lindstone and Ryan, a paper from 2015. Again, if you're interested, please email me in this particular one. But on page 8, they give this very nice quote. I'm just going to read it verbatim, because it talks about how teachers are controlled in the current historical moment in our country. So these researchers, critical theorists, say for at least 20 years, teachers have been casualties of declining support, tighter controls, intensified workloads, and discourses of derision. At the same time, they are under increasing pressure from politicians and the community to be more accountable and improve quality. In what has been referred to as the marketization of education, their positions have been further weakened by curriculum prescription, testing regimes, performance management, and multiple iterations of standards, documents purporting to enhance the professionalism of educators. According to Sachs, 2003, the imperatives of this market regime were for schools to produce numerate and literate students capable of civic and social responsibility as multi-skilled, flexible workers to boost the economy and increase international competitiveness. The complexity of these political agendas colonizing professionalism creates an overwhelming space for teachers to inhabit. So I just thought I'd read that because it very much ties into much of Johnson's argument. And I'll just again refer back to Johnson here for a few more important points in regards to this argument she's building about the label of the professional, how it she talks about it as being hinged on a kind of simplistic logic that actually there may be very little evidence. This notion that teachers who are unprofessional or teachers who teach poorly, where students fail to learn, that if we improve the quality or improve professionalization of teachers, then we will make these moves towards a highly competitive quality education system that can perform in the global competitive market that we now have with education. You hear that rhetoric from politicians a lot around that our standards are falling, that we need to focus on some core outcomes around what teachers are doing in classrooms, how they teach, in order to raise the standards or at least not let them slip any further of literacy, numeracy, science, etc. Hear that talked a lot of. And Johnson really questions this rhetoric and she references a lot of critical theorists around that there's that it's hinged on urban myths, they're linear, they're simplistic, equation between this notion that it's a panacea. So if we focus on teacher professionalism, the standardization of the profession, it can solve all these problems, that it'll go away. She talks about the reality is far more complex. So I just want to focus on another aspect that she writes, because this is a really critical idea for me, certainly in the way I work with pre-service teachers. I'm going to quote her here as well on page 303, where she talks about, she says, the idea is that one can be labelled as professional if one fits a set of criteria concerning knowledge of the profession itself, has a set of designated virtuous characteristics, and follows a set of rules as a code of conduct. Some of these criteria are set by stakeholders outside of the classroom, and others are determined by the personality or character of the teacher. Thus, the power to determine whether teachers are deemed to be professional in their behaviour and teaching pedagogy is often assigned to those who are outside the classroom and distanced from classroom practice. So this idea that we can clearly define through the ATEL standard, for example, what teachers do, and encompass everything through those 7 standards, and then label that person who meets those 7 criteria as thus being professional. What Johnson is arguing is based on a set of urban myths and assumptions that is far too linear and actually has costs to it when we undergo that process. It has costs. And I think Johnson does a good job of arguing those costs and what those are. And that, that these discernible characteristics that's based on evidence or evaluation, that we can articulate these professional standards, and that this has a cause and effect relationships to student learning, is implied, but actually the evidence is very light on the ground that this actually does anything. So, that may come, but certainly Johnson is in doubt of that, and many critical theorists have doubt of that, and we'll see what happens as this plays out. So far, the ATEL standards have been around for a few years now in various iterations. according to the standardized test, there's not much happening. But again, it's that the standardized test, like NAPLAN, is an indicator, and that there's a strong correlation. There's an issue there as well. Again, I just want to jump through. Johnson covers a lot of ground in her paper, and I think another important idea that she covers a little bit further on page 308. And you hear this from the government very much so, and she's arguing that there are some issues with this, that these 3 A's in education that you get from the federal government: achievement, accountability, and assessment, that's implicit in the discourse. So that if we talk about the professionalization of teachers and how one becomes professional, certainly through pre-service teacher education, is that they're able to demonstrate achievement, accountability, and assessment. And there's that focus on those 3 A's. And if teachers focus on those 3 A's, then and schools focus on ensuring that teachers meet those 3 A's, then therefore they'll be more professional, and the whole workforce will be as well. And she questions these assumptions. Professionalism is the same or equals quality. Professionalism is the same or that equals reform, and professionalism as reform and as quality. And she questioned those assumptions. So focus on that, because that's really important, because she then argues that research that shows either correlation or causation between improved student learning outcomes and the professionalization of the teaching workforce as a reform process is not evident. So it just isn't there. So, that these assumptions that really the whole AITSL standards are based on are simply that. They're assumptions. They're not based in evidence. They're not. There's nothing that shows a clear link that if we do this, therefore student learning will improve. Okay, so that's a really important point that is made in this paper. This idea that the government is so intensely involved in the professionalization of the teaching workforce, you've got to think, well, what are the outcomes here? What is being what are the results? For Johnson, certainly, she feels that it's devaluing and deprofessionalizing teachers, because teachers become less autonomous in their work because they have to adhere to these standards. And there is an underlying sense of trust and respect for what teachers do. Now, I'm not saying that all teachers necessarily have are fantastic at what they do and meet all of the student outcomes to improve learning and do the best for young people. You certainly would have had teachers in your own life where you thought, well, I'm amazed that they're a teacher. So I'm not arguing that teachers everywhere have this amazing professional autonomy to do great work, and that standards then undermine that. It's what Johnson is arguing, and certainly what I agree with her in, that the answer necessarily to bad teachers, even though that's far too simplistic a label, is not standardized. It's not a standardized set of criteria like the AITSL. That's my core belief. That I think, in fact, the standards have more cost to them than benefit. I think, and Johnson certainly cites Finland as an example, where a set of standard criteria around what is teaching competency is not necessarily the ultimate answer here. That there's much more important work to be done, certainly around that control of teachers and decontrolling, that we need to actually rein back. And if you look at Finland, and one example is that teachers' work is isn't controlled by government. Government stands away or stands outside of the work of teachers and schools, and there's an implicit trust there. So I think our government has an implicit distrust of teachers, whereas in Finland there is an implicit trust. And I mean, there are many other mechanisms working, including very high scores for teacher entry and et cetera, but and funding, much more funding into schools. But despite that, one critical difference is that control isn't there. And in fact, over the years, over the last 40 years, you've seen more things being taken out of the Finnish system than put in. And we just keep putting in more things, thinking that it'll fix. So it's like, you keep trying to add more into an already overstuffed system. So, let's put a national curriculum in, let's put national standards for teachers in, and let's hope that then that affects the outcomes we want. And in fact, the opposite is true. Again, just briefly on Johnson's paper, another important point I've just seen, I've highlighted, what standardized competencies do is they, again, assume that teachers are a homogenous group of people doing similar work everywhere. And if you've had any experience yourself of different kinds of schools, whether it's a metropolitan school in a city or a regional school, a rural school, there's such different contexts that require very different kinds of approaches and practices, and standards don't account for that. They don't account for context. They sort of say, well, this should apply to everyone. Whereas if you teach, you quickly realize that context is so critical and important. So I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. And as Johnson sort of winds up her argument and concludes things, she sort of talks about this point I like, where she on page 312, as the demands for greater professionalism have grown, so the AITSL are part of that, so too is the testing, appraisal and accountability of teachers, and more particularly of their students' learning. So, if standards alone were one thing, it would be sort of, okay, that's one thing to deal with, but teachers have to not just deal with the standardization of their own work, but the standardization of students' work. So how they learn, the curriculum that's now standardized across the country, the tests that are now standardized, and increasingly the methods and practices and strategies of teachers become more and more standardized because they have to align to these outcomes. Again, it's a critical theory approach, so it's raising lots of issues and problems with this, which I think is important, and some people are inclined that way. I certainly am. Other people think, I want to focus on the good things, which is, again, fair enough. But when you start working as a teacher, I think if you don't come to terms with some of the issues and the ways in which teachers work, as I began this video, have been controlled, if you're not aware of these forces, you quickly you become sideswiped by them, and you think, this isn't why I got into teaching. And this is certainly where Johnson points towards at the conclusion of her article here. She says that teachers leave the profession they once valued and worked hard for because they can no longer have the professional control and sense of achievement they once had. And she talks about the attrition rates of graduates, and if you're not aware of this statistic already, I'll cite it again if you are, because I think it's so important to be aware of. Up to 50% of new teachers leave in the first 5 years, and that is worrying. That is worrying for researchers, educational researchers such as myself, and teacher educators. It's worrying for schools. It's worrying for government. What is going on here? And numerous there've been numerous explanations given, but I do feel, and increasingly do feel, that these issues that I've been addressing in this video here and in Johnson's article, you can see it, that this control of teachers' work and this increasing focus on standardization of competencies and professional skills are part of the problem, not the solution. Just to end, where Johnson writes here on page 312, towards the end of 312, says, beyond this paradox, though, is the reductionism that is evident in the narrative of professionalism. When reducing the complex issues concerning teacher accountability, more focused professional learning, enhanced and quality teaching, and improved student learning to a simple professionalism or professionalizing the teaching workforce, many essential components are rendered inconsequential. So this notion that what is important in regards to the work of teachers, and from my point of view, certainly an ethic of care that I argue in my own research is around emotions in learning, and certainly that idea of an ethic of care and how critical that is rendered inconsequential. You will not see an ethic of care mentioned in the standards, and what does care mean, and how do we explore and explain the caring work of teachers and the emotional work of teaching, and certainly how that is rendered or rendered inconsequential in some regards, even though everybody knows it. So it's of such consequence as soon as you start teaching, and other teachers will tell you that. When we're brought under the standards, and when our focus is on that in terms of that career development, you then begin to pay less attention to those important aspects of the work, and certainly the critical analysis of the care that goes into your everyday practice as a teacher. So I think that's really important, and understanding, as I've mentioned, what are the costs here, what are the dangerous effects of the standards, and how teachers have been rendered in particular ways, and how you are being rendered in particular ways as a result of the standards, and how your practice evolving and learning practice, yes, but how that's being shaped, because you become what you are told and how you are told to be. So if you're becoming the standards, at what cost? What are the costs of becoming something else? And how do you craft perhaps a different kind of teacher in response to the standards? So instead of using the standards as defining everything that you are as a teacher, or becoming as a teacher, as somebody who's learning, you in fact use them as a counter. You say, well, actually, that I can see that those are there, and I understand that those are there, but how do I craft somebody else? How do I, in a way, use that as something productive, that I can understand that's the terrain in front of me, but how I use that to shape my own professional identity in response to it, rather than just adhering within it, is very important, I think, and certainly a way forward in a lot of this really complex landscape, modern teaching landscape that we exist in at the moment. So I hope this has been informative and useful for you, and please pose any questions you may have if you want me to explain, or please email me if you would like any of the references I've talked about that I haven't uploaded for this particular topic. If you are interested in some of this critical theory approach, some of the researchers I've cited or read from today, just email me and I'll send you the full reference. So thank you for engaging, and the next topic will continue in a way to explore some of these perspectives.